Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. Well, as you know, there have been many protests for social justice in our country over the last several months. I thought this would be a good time to take a look back at a tragic event that happened in Georgia 56 years ago this month in July 1964. Then as now, they galvanized the nation's attention on race and matters of civil rights, and for the first time brought the full power of the federal government to bear in bringing to justice white men accused of murdering an African American, and to bring them to justice in federal court. Now, on July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson, signed the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. This was the most important piece of civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction period nearly 100 years before. It had been opposed by all white Southern congressmen in the Senate and the House. No small irony in having a president from Texas sign this, champion of civil rights, signing this act into law on July 2nd, a date so close to our nation's birth date of July 4th. Just 9 days later, an event happened right here in Georgia that would bring that act into the spotlight again in helping to bring the murderers of an African American to justice, the murder of a man who was traveling through Georgia. That summer, 48-year-old Lemuel Penn, an African American veteran of World War II, was doing reserve training at Fort Benning. Now, Lemuel Penn had served in the Pacific Theater in World War II. He had earned the Bronze Star. He was the father of three, the assistant superintendent of the public schools of Washington, D.C., doing reserve training that summer, and when it was over, he and two fellow officers, also African Americans, decided to drive back to D.C. from Columbus, and they traveled that warm July night through Athens, Georgia, where they were spotted by three local white men who saw the Washington, D.C. plates. They were members of the local Ku Klux Klan. They grabbed shotguns, jumped in their car, and began following Lemuel Penn and his colleagues as they drove north out of Athens. 22 miles north of the city, just as they crossed over the Broad River, the white men pulled up alongside, opened fire with their shotguns, and killed Lemuel Penn, who was driving. Now, two men were arrested by local authorities and charged in state superior court with murder. But as had happened so many times before, a blatant appeal to white supremacy by their lawyers to an all-white, all-male jury resulted in an acquittal for both of them. Now, before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was no appeal to federal court. Most famously in 1955, when Emmett Till was murdered by two white men in Mississippi, they were acquitted by an all-white jury, and that was the end of the story. But not so in 1964. President Johnson sent the FBI down into Athens. They gathered a ton of evidence, and in 1966, six white men from Athens were indicted on federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder. For the first time, the full force of the Civil Rights Act had been brought to bear. 4 of the men were acquitted, but 2 of them were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and were sentenced to 10 years in federal penitentiary. They served 6. Now, Lemuel Penn was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, a martyr, of course, to our country's civil rights movement. In 2006, the Georgia Historical Society erected a historical marker at the site where he was murdered, just by the Broad River, as part of its Civil Rights Trail initiative, commemorating the man who was murdered 56 years ago this month, on July 11th, 1964, as part of the long, long story on the road to racial justice in our country. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.